Hello, everyone. I'm State Representative Emma Mulvaney-Stanak. I represent Chittenden 6-2, which is in Burlington's Old North End and New North End. And I'm here today to talk a bit about some wage policy and worker protection policy ideas that I'll be advancing in the 2022 legislative session, along with a few colleagues in the State House. So it's pretty obvious in this pandemic that workers are organically organizing to really stand up about working conditions and wages and the treatment they've had in low wage jobs in this state and elsewhere in the country. And it's because folks have come to terms with the fact that you don't have to work that way. And if we collectively decide that there's different priorities in life, like only working when you can achieve a livable wage, working when you have a reliable work schedule, for example, that's better for workers' well-being, for their family, for finding childcare and other pieces that just make life more livable. So it's time for state policies to catch up and modernize and support workers and be part of the worker pandemic recovery, as I like to say, so that we're not just focusing our policies on the economics of businesses and really looking at our holistic economy as workers, because businesses cannot operate without workers. No employer can. So there's a few bills that were already introduced into the legislature last session around minimum wage policy, but they've really have just sat. And this is the time to catch up, because a lot of employers have realized they can't hire people at the state minimum wage anymore, which is about $11.50 an hour. It will go up again on January 1st. They've realized they've had to bump it well over $15 an hour in most places to attract people back to a retail and service job. And so now it's time to push for $15 an hour by 2025 or sooner, for that matter. And that's one of the bills that we're really hoping to put some new energy behind, because the time is right. The other piece of that, which will require an amendment that I'm very supportive of, because it gets at gender and race discrimination in terms of systemic race and gender discrimination and policymaking over decades, is the tipped minimum wage. Many states, including Vermont, have a sub-tiered minimum wage, which is half of the standard minimum wage that was required to be paid to folks who consistently get tips as part of their income. Now, while at the end of the day, people are still required to get $11.50 or so an hour between tips and that base wage, it has historically been an act of discrimination for folks of color in the South. This is where the origins of this policy came from. And we know that mostly women and women of color work in tipped industry jobs. This is not just restaurant workers, but also housekeepers and folks who work in the tourist industry. So it's time to eliminate that. Other states have done this already. Other cities have done this already. And it's good policy to make sure that we can do right by those workers. Another piece of minimum wage policy, before I move on to worker protections, is looking at all of the antiquated exemptions we have. And this again gets to a racial justice and wage justice issue, because we still have exemptions to minimum wage for agricultural workers. And we know that in Vermont, many of the agricultural workers are migrant workers, folks of color, who deserve, just like anyone else, the ability to earn a livable wage and certainly not be exempted from minimum wage, which we know is already below a livable standard. So looking at that exemption, there's other exemptions within minimum wage for nonprofit workers, and a few pieces that don't even line up with federal policy anymore. So going back to that theme of modernizing, this is a time to really align policy that supports workers. The final couple pieces around workplace protections and really empowering workers will be to look at a couple pieces around reliable work schedules. This is a piece, again, to more service and low wage, service and retail jobs and low wage workers. Many folks, I think it's about a third of workers who work in that industry, often don't get their work schedule much more than a couple days before they have to work it. And there's other sub pieces of there around sometimes being sent home early if there's not enough customers. There's all these, I view them as anti-worker schedule issues that the state could really stabilize for folks, so that people could perhaps work a second job if needed, or get reliable childcare, or go to school and finish a degree or get a second degree, which you cannot do if you don't have a reliable and predictable work schedule. It's a matter of justice, fairness, and respect in many ways. So a reliable work schedule piece. Another part is, it came out from actually a constituent of mine, the point that our economy is shifting and there are many more remote workers now. So not just for low wage workers, but for folks who are a little bit more moderately income. Remote workers are already receiving the grunt of expenses by working from home, and employers not necessarily outfitting home offices, high speed internet, all these expenses are like these hidden costs being shifted to workers. And even before the pandemic, about a dozen states already had a reimbursement requirement for employers. Vermont should also follow suit, because if we are going to do all this supporting remote workers and more livability of ending commuting for all of the climate impacts, we have to remember there's cost shifts that also happen to workers. And that's a good couple $1,000s at least a year that we could protect workers from having to shoulder for their employers, who are maybe not even having an office to have to rent downtown anymore. And I think it's another good policy that wraps around a broader group of workers than just low wage workers. So those are some pieces around, oh, and the final piece about workplace justice really for workers is to provide a just cause right to all at-will employees in the state. So if you have a union, which is great if you have a union, but it's a very small percentage of folks in Vermont who have access to a unionized workplace. If you're there, you do have a just cause termination right in your contract if you have a good union. And that means that you can't just be fired at will by your employer for a host of different reasons. So if we extended that right to workers, it would again create more stability and rights for folks in workplaces, and make the burden of having to prove, which is very narrow here, prove a case of discrimination for gender or race or sexual identity or whatnot, that this will provide people due process basically if there's a termination or even a reprimand happening in a workplace. So those are a few pieces. The last piece I'll wrap up on is going a little bit more into what else can we be doing to strengthen our gender and wage gap policies. We have some legislation already on the books, statutes to really provide wage transparency. So kind of making sure that employers can't be opaque about what salaries and wages are offered. But we could do better. And we can also, I think, beef up the racial identity category. So it's not just gender identity based, but also making sure California did this 2 years ago to add racial identity as a protected reason that employers cannot use as a reason to provide a different wage or salary for someone because of their known or unknown bias that they're applying when they're applying salaries or promotions or whatnot for folks. I think we could also create some better transparency around if a prospective employee volunteers their salary history. Often, especially if it's a woman, it's used in a way to lower negotiations and ability for women or female identified folks to do their best to get a higher salary when accepting a job. And right now, if a prospective employee volunteers that information, it can be used legally as by the employer to finagle the range for which they offer the person. So I want to strengthen that and make sure that employers, even if it's volunteered, cannot use that against what they would have offered that employee. So even if the person was working like $20,000 less in their former job, that the new employer has to offer what they were really intending to offer for their salary range. And the last piece I'll say on that is I think the biggest piece is employers should be required to share their wages and salary information when they post a job. It is not done consistently throughout the state. This will help on a number of angles for folks returning to the workforce from unemployment who know they're applying for jobs that actually pay comparable or more than the job that they last lost. That's, again, an opaque area now where you don't know. It also creates transparency. So employers who are paying very low wages and then claim that they don't know why people are not applying for their jobs or following through know that it's because they're lowballing what they should be paying compared to across the industry around the state. And frankly, will help the state of Vermont be able to better, I think, match prospective employees, which is part of the state's job, with employers by making sure that we're leveling up and having folks be transparent on what they offer for workers. So it's a whole suite of issues, hoping to move at least a few of them, but they're so intertwined that the biggest piece here is to make sure that message is clear in policymaking, that you can't just change the minimum wage and forget about all these other pieces, because worker well-being is really a mosaic of different policy issues. And to bring those pieces together, I think is both smart and better policymaking strategy.